Hello, this video is all about the React lifecycle mounting phase, and it's the second in a two-part series on the React lifecycle mounting phase. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to use the componentDidMount function to set a component state post-render. We're going to talk about all this. You already know how to do this. You've already seen it done. You've worked with an application that does this. Now we're just showing some light to this idea. Okay, this week is all about just getting you more at-bats with the React API, with the React package, so that you will be React professionals by the end. So what is componentDidMount? Okay, like render, this method lives on the base React component class. So React.component, that's kind of a typo there. The class that we extend from the base component class, that's where we get this method from. So it will always be a part of the mounting phase. Okay, notice that it has the mount term in it. componentDidMount is a method that we will use on the mounting phase. Okay, and it will be invoked exactly after render gets called. So it'll only get invoked if it exists. Okay, if it exists on the component, it'll get invoked. It will only be invoked once. So it's a really good place to initiate some sort of asynchronous data rendering, stuff like that. And that's exactly what it's used for, it's used for any async data loading that you would need to have on state during the render. So what does this term async data loading mean? What does it all mean? Well, remember that this method is guaranteed to be called only once in the whole life cycle, and it's going to be called immediately after a component is mounted. Okay, so when I say that this method is very good for loading in some asynchronous data, I mean data that does not live in like a people.js file necessarily on your application. Although that's the example we're going to give you, and I'm going to show you a really cool example that you can work with in your challenge after our little follow along exercise. Okay, so let's explain what async data actually means, just so you get the broad picture of this entire process. So on the left, we have a picture of our computer. That computer is sort of supposed to indicate the client-side React component application that you have going on your screen. So your web browser should be that computer, okay? This computer, what can happen is we are talking across the World Wide Web with other computers, other networks, other servers, and requesting information. So we have some files that live across the World Wide Web, and we want to get those files to us. So what happens is our client, our web browser, will make that request to another server somewhere. That server will then communicate with a database and say, yes, I have that information, or not, I don't have that information. And then what happens if it does have that information, it's going to send back the requested data to the server. The server is then going to send that back all the way to our client. Okay, this process takes time. So what we can do with componentDidMount is we can control this process of data requesting in our components. So that way, when we request some data, if we don't have that data back, what we can do is we can show a message to the user that explains that we don't have that data. Okay? So now what I want you to do is I want you to open up that same code sandbox that you had open and you were working on and you built using friends. And I want you to work through this exercise with me there. Wherever you're at in that application, we're only going to make one tweak to that assignment, and it's going to change just one thing, one way we load our data. Okay, and we're going to do some console logging, and it's going to be great. So let's dive in. Go ahead and open up that code sandbox that has to do with your friends and the people, and get that up and running so that we can jump right in and get coding. Okay, so your application should actually look a lot better than mine right now. I haven't done anything to extend it. I haven't solved the challenge at all. I haven't, extended this application at all. But remember, what this is all about is exposing you to the React mounting phase in the React component lifecycle. Okay, so I'm going to just give us a little bit of real estate here so we can work with what we're going to be working with. And if you're going to go ahead and follow along with me, make sure that you have this up and running. If not, you can find a link to this inside of your training kit. Okay, so I'm going to define our componentDidMount. As with all of our methods that come from the React component base class, we get them on our class itself. So we can use this syntax right here, and this will just automatically be used by the base class that we extend, right? So as we call super and we set up our constructor, we get access to these methods that we're extending from the parent class here, okay? So componentDidMount, it will get called in the mounting phase of the lifecycle like so. Constructor function will get invoked. Okay, going to set up our initial data, any default data that we need set up or anything like that. Then our render method will get invoked. Okay, so shortly after our rendered method will be invoked, if componentDidMount exists, so too will it get invoked. So I'm just going to take this, I'm going to copy it and drag it down over into componentDidMount, and I'm going to say CDM called or invoked. Okay, I'm going to save that, open up in a new window. And I want to look at my console now. So if I look at my console, you can see that our constructor function was invoked, and then render was invoked, and now componentDidMount was invoked directly after the render method. This is the process, and this is something that you will use constantly within the React component lifecycle ecosystem. You will use componentDidMount for a variety of purposes, but the main purpose is to send off some sort of request for some information, sort of like our image depicted earlier, okay? Now, to show you kind of how that would work, let's imagine that people here is going to actually be, it's going to live on a server somewhere else. So this people object, this people array that has all of this information on it, lives on a computer somewhere else, okay? We're going to just assume that for right now. And instead of invoking friends and setting up our people on friends to initialize it, I'm just going to initialize it to an empty array. A very common practice in the React ecosystem is to initialize your state data, your arrays, as empty arrays. And then we'll assume, right, just all you're going to do is make assumptions here. Okay, we're going to say, I want to invoke componentDidMount, right? Because that's what's going to happen as soon as render gets called. As long as componentDidMount exists, it will be invoked in the lifecycle of our mounting phase of our component. So now we can go and fetch that data. But one thing that we can do inside of our componentDidMount is call setState. So I'm just going to simply invoke this .setState. Remember, it's a function. And we can use either the functional setState or just the traditional flat object, which is in this case totally sufficient. And I'm just going to set friends as people. Imagine that we're calling this function setState after we have a positive response from the server. Now, I don't want you to get too caught up in the responses from the server at this point, because I want you to focus on just simply using componentDidMount to initialize some state data at this point, okay? So what's going to happen after setState gets called? Who can think back to some of the original rules of setState that we went through earlier on in our process of learning React? Okay, so remember, reflect on those things. setState actually forces a re-render to be called. Okay, let me repeat that. setState will force render to be re-invoked. Okay, so render gets invoked after setState every single time, unless you specify otherwise, which we're not going to get into at this point. But setState is very commonly used in the updating portion of our React component lifecycle. In this case, we're using it inside of the mounting phase, which means we're going to call render again. Okay, and at the point we call render, we're going to take friends and we're going to display it with the people. We're going to set the people up on state. So if I go ahead now and save this file, we're going to go ahead and look back over our app, and I'm just going to refresh the page so we get a clean console here. I want you to focus in on this stuff. Initially, our constructor function was invoked. Directly after, render was invoked. Then componentDidMount was called, and then render was re-invoked. Okay? So we didn't have initially our friends data on state. We used componentDidMount to set state. Okay. Now I'm going to pull over our training kit because I want to highlight this inside of training kit for you. Okay. So notice that you have a lot of information about componentDidMount. And notice that there is a really cool challenge for you to kind of go through, okay? The challenge is really fun. It's going to fetch for some dogs across the World Wide Web and give you those dog URLs back, and you can display those as images, okay? That's the challenge. But before you do that, I want you to go ahead and click on the follow along exercise, read through this and follow along and do this same exact thing on your own as well. So you actually have two challenges. Now that we have done this together, I want you to go through this city list data exercise and build out a little application and do what you want with those items, and then move into your challenge and do this, copy and paste this code over to your componentDidMount function, and see what happens, okay? Start playing around with it, and you're gonna start working on stuff that you're gonna be getting into in the coming weeks. Okay? Have fun and let us know if you get stuck, because we're here to help.